All right. Hello everyone. I don't know if I'm gonna upload this, but see, I've got some history homework to do, and I gotta read through this book, and I thought maybe it'd be interesting if I read through the chapter out loud. Maybe you can sleep to this or whatever. I I'll try to not make that much noise. But yeah, I'm gonna be reading chapter three, settling the northern colonies, of the American Pageant book by David M. Kennedy, Elizabeth Cohen, and Thomas A. Bailey. So, yeah, I'm gonna be reading through this chapter, and maybe if you have this book, you can follow along. But I'm gonna read through it. Okay. Although colonists both North and South were bound together by a common language and a common allegiance to Mother England, they established different patterns of settlement, different economies, different political systems, and even different sets of values, defining distinctive regional characteristics that would persist for generations. The promise of riches, especially from golden leaf tobacco, drew the first settlers to the southern colonies. But to the north, in the fertile valleys of the Middle Atlantic region, and especially along the rocky shores of New England, it was not worldly wealth, but religious devotion, that principally shaped the earliest settlements. Alright, this is the next little mini section. It's called The Protestant Reformation Produces Puritanism. Little did the German friar Martin Luther suspect, when he nailed his protests against Catholic doctrines to the door of Wittenberg's cathedral in 1517, that he was shaping the destiny of a yet unknown nation. Denouncing the authority of priests and popes, Luther declared that the Bible alone was the source of God's word. He ignited a fire of religious reform, the Protestant Reformation, that licked its way across Europe for more than a century, dividing peoples, toppling sovereigns, and kindling the spiritual fervor of millions of men and women, some of whom helped to found America. The reforming flame burned especially brightly in the bosom of John Calvin of Geneva. The somber and severe religious leader elaborated Martin Luther's ideas in ways that profoundly affected the thought and character of generations of Americans yet unborn. Calvinism became the dominant theological credo, but not only of the New England Puritans, but of other American settlers as well, including the Presbyterians. Scottish Presbyterians. French, wow, big words here. French Huguenots and Communicants of the Dutch Reformed Church. Sorry for stumbling there, I've never seen a lot of those words. Calvin spelled out his basic doctrine in a learned Latin tome of 1536, entitled Institutes of Christian Religion. God, Calvin argued, was all powerful and all good. Humans, because of the corrupting effect of original sin, were weak and wicked. God was also all-knowing, and he knew who was going to heaven and who was going to hell. Since the first moment of creation, some souls, the elect, had been destined for eternal bliss and others for eternal torment. Good works could not save those whom predestination bad marked for the infernal fires. But neither could elect count on their predetermined salvation and lead lives of wild, immoral abandon. For one thing, no one could be certain of his or her status in the heavenly ledger. Gnawing doubts about their eternal fate plagued Calvinists. They constantly sought in themselves and others signs of conversion, or the receipt of God's free gift of saving grace. Conversion was thought to be an intense, identifiable personal experience in which God revealed to their elect their heavenly destiny. Thereafter, they were expected to lead sanctified lives, demonstrating by their holy behavior they were among the visible saints. These doctrines swept into England just as King Henry the Fourth was breaking his ties into the Roman Catholic Church in the 1530s, making himself the head of the Church of England. Henry would have been content to retain Roman rituals and creeds, but his action powerfully stimulated some English religious reformers to undertake a total purification of English Christianity. Many of these Puritans, as it happened, came from the commercially depressed woolen districts see page 28. Calvinism, with its message of stark but reassuring order in the divine plan, fed on the social unrest and provides spiritual comfort to the economically disadvantaged. Now, sorry for stopping reading here, but I have to move my book because my neck is starting to hurt. Alright, I believe I was right here. As time went on, Puritans grew increasingly unhappy over the snail-like progress of the Protestant Reformation in England. They burned with pious zeal, which, if you don't know, that means deeply religious, zeal to see the Church of England wholly decatholized. Decatholicized. I don't think that's a word. The most devout Puritans, including those who eventually settled New England, believed that only visible saints, that is, persons who felt the stirrings of grace in their souls and could demonstrate its presence to their fellow Puritans, should be admitted to church membership. But the Church of England enrolled all the king's subjects, which meant that the saints had to share pews and communion rails with the damned. Appalled by this unholy fraternizing, a tiny group of dedicated Puritans known as Separatists vowed to break away entirely from the Church of England. King James I, a shrewd Scotsman, was head of both the state and the church in England from 1603 to 1625. He quickly perceived that if his subjects could defy him as their spiritual leader, they might one day defy him as their political leader, as in fact they would later defy and behead his son, Charles I. He therefore threatened to harass the more bothersome Separatists out of the land. Alright, this next mini-section is called The Pilgrims and Their Pilgrimage at Plymouth. The most famous congregation of Separatists, fleeing royal wrath, departed for Holland in 1608. During the ensuing 12 years of toil and poverty, they were increasingly distressed by the Dutchification of their children. They longed to find a haven where they could live and die as Englishmen and women, and as purified Protestants. America was the logical refuge. Despite the early ordeals of Jamestown, and despite tales of New World cannibals roasting steaks from their white victims over open fires. A group of Separatists in Holland, after negotiating with the Virginia Company, at length secured rights to settle under its jurisdiction. But the crowded Mayflower, 65 days at sea, missed its destination and arrived off the stony coast of New England in 1620, with a total of 102 persons. One had died en route, an unusually short casualty list, and one had been born and appropriately named Oceanus. Fewer than half of the entire party were Separatists. Prominent among the non-belongers was a peppery and stocky soldier of fortune, Captain Miles Standish, dubbed by one of his critics Captain Shrimp. He later rendered indispensable service as an Indian fighter and negotiator. The Pilgrims did not make their initial landing at Plymouth Rock, as commonly supposed, but undertook a number of preliminary surveys. They finally chose for their site the shore of inhospitable Plymouth Bay. This area was outside the domain of the Virginia Company, and consequently the settlers became squatters. They were without legal right to the land and without specific authority to establish a government. Before disembarking, the Pilgrim leaders drew up and signed the brief Mayflower Compact. Although settling an invaluable precedent for later written constitutions, this document was not a constitution at all. It was a simple agreement to form a crude government and to submit to the will of the majority under the regulations agreed upon. The compact was signed by 41 adult males, 11 of them with the exalted rank of Mr., though not by the servants and 2 seamen. The pact was a promising step toward genuine self-government, for soon the adult male settlers were assembling to make their own laws in open discussion town meetings, a great laboratory of liberty. The Pilgrims' first winter of 1620 to 1621 took a grisly toll. Only 44 of the original 102 survived. At one time, only 7 were well enough to lay their dead in their frosty graves. Yet when the Mayflower sailed back to England in the spring, not a single one of the courageous band of Separatists left. As one of them wrote, "It is not with us as with other men, whom small things can discourage." I guess they're basically saying, like, we're strong, so we're not going to leave, unlike other people. God made his children prosperous, so the Pilgrims believed. The next autumn, that of 1621, brought bountiful harvests, and with them the first Thanksgiving Day in New England. In time, the frail colony found sound economic legs in fur, fish, and lumber. Sorry. The beaver and the Bible were their early mainstays, the one for the sustenance of the body, the other for the sustenance of the soul. Plymouth proved that the English could maintain themselves in this uninviting region. The Pilgrims were extremely fortunate in their leaders. Prominent among them was the cultured William Bradford, a self-taught scholar who read Hebrew, Greek, Latin, French, and Dutch. He was chosen governor 30 times in the annual elections. Among his major worries was his fear that independent, non-Puritan settlers on their particular might corrupt his godly experiment in the... And then there's a small little note in the lower right. I guess I'll read that too. William Bradford, 1590 through 1657, wrote in Of Plymouth Plantation. Thus out of small beginnings greater things have been produced by his hand that made all things of nothing, and gives being to all things that are, and as one small candle may light 1,000, so the light here kindled hath shone unto many, yet in some sort to our whole nation. Alright, after that little section, I guess I got cut off in the last part, I'll start the last sentence again. Among his major worries was his fear that independent non-Puritan settlers... Oh, this is talking about William Bradford still. He was a self-taught scholar who could read Hebrew, Greek, Latin, French, and Dutch. He was chosen governor 30 times in the annual elections. Among his major worries was his fear that independent non-Puritan settlers on their particular might corrupt his godly experiment in the wilderness. Bustling fishing villages and other settlements did sprout to the north of Plymouth, on the storm-lashed shores of Massachusetts Bay, where many people were as much interested in God as God. It makes so much sense it rhymes. Quiet and quaint, the little colony of Plymouth was never important economically or numerically. Its population numbered only 7,000 by 1691, when, still charterless, it emerged with its giant neighbor, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But the tiny settlement of Pilgrims was big both morally and spiritually. Someone left a note here that says, better word, please, for big. I don't know why they did that, but okay. This next little mini section is called the Bay Colony Bible Commonwealth. I'm sorry if my voice sounds weird. I'm starting to feel hoarse in my throat, so I had to get some water. The Separatist Pilgrims were dedicated extremists, the purest Puritans. More moderate Puritans sought to reform the Church of England from within. Though resented by bishops and monarchs, they slowly gathered support, especially in Parliament. But when Charles I dismissed Parliament in 1629 and sanctioned the anti-Puritan persecutions of the reactionary Archbishop William Laud, many Puritans saw catastrophe in the making. In 1629, an energetic group of non-separatist Puritans, fearing for their faith and for England's future, secured a royal charter to form the Massachusetts Bay Company. They proposed to establish a sizable settlement in the infertile Massachusetts area, with Boston soon becoming its hub. Stealing a march on both king and church, the newcomers brought their charter with them. For many years they used it as a kind of constitution, out of easy reach of royal authority. They steadfastly denied that they wanted to separate from the Church of England, only from its impurities. But back in England, the highly orthodox Archbishop Laud snorted that the Bay Colony Puritans were swine which rooted in God's vineyard. The Massachusetts Bay enterprise was singularly blessed. The well-equipped expedition of 1630, with 11 vessels carrying nearly 1,000 immigrants, started the colony off on a larger scale than any of the other English settlements. Continuing turmoil in England tossed up additional enriching waves of Puritans on the shores of Massachusetts in the following decade. During the Great Migration of the 1630s, about 70,000 refugees left England, but not all of them were Puritans, and only about 20,000 came to Massachusetts. Many were attracted to the warm and fertile West Indies, especially the sugar-rich island of Barbados. More Puritans came to this Caribbean islet than to all of Massachusetts. Many fairly prosperous, educated persons immigrated to the Bay Colony, including John Winthrop, a well-to-do pillar of English society, who became the colony's first governor. A successful attorney and manor lord in England, Winthrop eagerly accepted the offer to become governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, believing that he had a calling from God to lead the new religious experiment. He served as governor or deputy governor for 19 years. The resources and skills of talented settlers like Winthrop helped Massachusetts prosper, as fur trading, fishing, and shipbuilding blossomed into important industries, especially fish and chips. That's fish and ships, mind you, not fish and chips. Massachusetts Bay Colony rapidly shot to the fore as both the biggest and most influential of the New England outposts. Massachusetts also benefited from a shared sense of purpose among most of the first settlers. "We shall be as a city upon a hill, a beacon to humanity," declared Governor Winthrop. The Puritan Bay colonists believed that they had a covenant with God, an agreement to build a holy society that would be a model for humankind. By the way, city upon a hill basically means a perfect society. So he's basically saying we're going to be a perfect society, which does not exist, but you know, you're proud of where you come from, you're proud of what you do, yada yada yada. Alright, so the next section is called Building the Bay Colony. So here we go. These common convictions deeply shaped the infant colony's life. Soon after the colonists' arrival, the franchise was extended to all freemen, adult males who belonged to the Puritan congregations, which in time came to be called collectively the Congregational Church. Unchurched men remained voteless in provincial elections, as did women. On this basis, about 2/5 of adult males enjoyed the franchise in provincial affairs, a far larger proportion than in contemporary England. Town governments, which conducted much important business, were even more inclusive. Their all-male property holders, and in some cases other residents as well, enjoyed the priceless boon of publicly discussing local issues, often with much heat, and of voting on them by a majority rule, show of hands. Yet the provincial government, liberal by the standards of the time, was not a democracy. The able Governor Winthrop feared and distrusted the commons as the meaner sort, and thought that democracy was the meanest and worst of all forms of government. And if the people be governors, asked one Puritan clergyman. "Who shall be governed?" True, the freemen annually elected the governor and his assistants, as well as a representative assembly called the General Court, but only Puritans, the visible saints, who alone were eligible for church membership, could be freemen. And according to the doctrine of the Covenant, the whole purpose of government was to enforce God's laws, which applied to believers and non-believers alike. Moreover, non-believers as well as believers paid taxes for the government to support church. Religious leaders thus wielded enormous influence in the Massachusetts Bible Commonwealth. They powerfully influenced admission to church membership by conducting public interrogations of persons claiming to have experienced conversion. Prominent among the early clergy was fiery John Cotton. Educated at England's Cambridge University, a Puritan citadel, he immigrated to Massachusetts to avoid persecution for his criticism of the Church of England. In the Bay Colony, he devoted his considerable learning to defending the government's duty to enforce religious rules. Profoundly pious, he sometimes preached and prayed up to 6 hours in a single day. But the power of the preachers was not absolute. A congregation had the right to hire and fire its minister and to set his salary. Clergymen were also barred from holding formal political office. Puritans in England had suffered too much at the hands of a political Anglican clergy to permit in the New World another unholy union of religious and government power. In a limited way, the Bay colonists thus endorsed the idea of the separation of church and state. The Puritans were a worldly lot, despite, or even because of, their spiritual intensity. Like John Winthrop, they believed in the doctrine of a calling to do God's work on earth. They shared in what was later called the Protestant ethic, which involved serious commitment to work and to engagement in worldly pursuits. Legend to the contrary, they also enjoyed simple pleasures. They ate plentifully, drank heartily, sang psalms occasionally, and made love monogamously. I guess that means they had sex a lot. Like other peoples of their time in both America and Europe, they passed laws aimed at making sure that these pleasures stayed simple by repressing certain human instincts. In New Haven, for example, a young married couple was fined 20 shillings for the crime of kissing in public, and in later years, Connecticut came to be dubbed the Blue Law State. It was so named for the blue paper on which the repressive laws, also known as sumptuary laws, were printed. Yet life was serious business, and hellfire was real, a hell where sinners shriveled and shrieked in vain for divine mercy. An immensely popular poem in New England, selling one copy for every 20 people, was clergyman Michael Wigglesworth's. That's a real name. Was clergyman Michael Wigglesworth's Day of Doom, 1662. Especially horrifying were his descriptions of the fate of the damned, which I'll read for you here. They cry, they roar for anguish sore, and gnaw their tongues for horror. But get away without delay. Christ pities not your cry. Depart to hell, there may you yell, and roar eternally. Wow. Pretty big words for someone named Michael Wigglesworth. Michael Wigglesworth. What a name. Anyway. Alright, so this next mini section is called Trouble in the Bible Commonwealth. The Bay Colony enjoyed a high degree of social harmony stemming from common beliefs in its early years, but even in this highly knit community, dissension soon appeared. Quakers, who flouted the authority of the Puritan clergy, were persecuted with fines, floggings, and banishment. In one extreme case, 4 Quakers who defied expulsion, one of them a woman, were hanged on the Boston Common. A sharp challenge to Puritan orthodoxy came from Anne Hutchinson. She was an exceptionally intelligent, strong-willed, and talkative woman, ultimately the mother of 14 children. Swift and sharp in theological argument, she carried to logical extremes the Puritan doctrine of predestination. She claimed that holy life was no sure sign of salvation and that the truly saved need not bother to obey the law of either God or man. This assertion, known as antinomianism from the Greek against the law, was high heresy. Brought to trial in 1638, the quick-witted Hutchinson bamboozled her clerical inquisitors for days, until she eventually boasted that she had come by her beliefs through a direct revelation from God. This was even higher heresy. The Puritan magistrates had little choice but to banish her, lest she pollute the entire Puritan experiment. With her family, she sailed on foot for Rhode Island, though pregnant. She finally moved to New York, where she and all but one of her household were killed by Indians. Back in the Bay Colony, the pious John Winthrop saw God's hand in her fate. More threatening to the Puritan leaders was a personable and popular Salem minister, Roger Williams. Williams was a young man with radical ideas and an unrestrained tongue. An extreme supremacist, he hounded his fellow clergymen to make a clean break with the corrupt Church of England. He also challenged the legality of the Bay Colony's character, which he condemned for expropriating the land from the Indians without fair compensation. As if all this were not enough, he went on to deny the authority of civil government to regulate religious behavior, a serious blow at the Puritan idea of government's very purpose. Their patience exhausted in 1635, the Bay Colony authorities found Williams guilty of disseminating new and dangerous opinions and ordered him banished. He was permitted to remain several months longer because of illness, but he kept up his criticisms. The outraged magistrates, fearing that he might organize a rival colony of malcontents, made plans to exile him to England, but Williams foiled them. Alright, the next mini section here is called the Rhode Island Sewer, and sewer is in quotes. Aided by friendly Indians, Roger Williams fled to the Rhode Island area in 1636, in the midst of bitter winter. At Providence, the courageous and far-visioned Williams built a Baptist church, probably the first in America. He established complete freedom of religion, even for Jews and Catholics. He demanded no oaths regarding religious beliefs, no compulsory attendance at worship, no taxes to support a state church. He even sheltered the abused Quakers, although disagreeing sharply with their views. Williams' endorsement of religious tolerance made Rhode Island more liberal than any of the other English settlements in the New World, and more advanced than most Old World communities as well. Those outcasts who clustered about Roger Williams enjoyed additional blessings. They exercised simple manhood suffering from the start, though this broad-minded practice was later narrowed by a property qualification. Opposed to special privilege of any sort, the doughty Rhode Islanders managed to achieve remarkable freedom of opportunity. Other scattered settlements soon dotted Rhode Island. They consisted largely of malcontents and exiles, some of whom could not bear the stifling theological atmosphere of the Bay Colony. Many of these restless souls in Rogues Island, including Anne Hutchinson, had little in common with Roger Williams, except being unwelcome anywhere else. The Puritan clergy back in Boston sneered at Rhode Island as that sewer in which the Lord's debts had collected and rotted. Planted by dissenters and exiles, Rhode Island became strongly individualistic and stubbornly independent. With good reason, Little Rhodey was later known as the traditional home of the otherwise minded. Begun as a squatter colony in 1636 without legal standing, it finally established rights to the soil when it secured a charter from Parliament in 1644. A huge bronze statue of the independent man appropriately stands today on the dome of the State House in Providence. Alright, so this next mini section is called New England Spreads Out. The smiling valley of the Connecticut River, one of the few highly fertile expanses of any size in all New England, had meanwhile attracted a sprinkling of Dutch and English settlers. Hartford was founded in 1635. The next year witnessed a spectacular beginning of the centuries-long westward movement across the continent. An energetic group of Boston Puritans, led by the Reverend Thomas Hooker, swarmed as a body into the Hartford area, with the ailing Mrs. Hooker carried on a horse litter. 3 years later, in 1639, the settlers of the New Connecticut River Colony drafted an open meeting, a trailblazing document known as the Fundamental Orders. It was in effect a modern constitution, which established a regime democratically controlled by the substantial citizens. Essential features of the Fundamental Orders were later borrowed by Connecticut for its colonial charter and ultimately for its state constitution. Another flourishing Connecticut settlement began to spring up at New Haven in 1638. It was a prosperous community founded by Puritans who contrived to set up an even closer church-government alliance than in Massachusetts. Although only squatters without a charter, the colonists dreamed of making New Haven a bustling seaport. But they fell into disfavor with Charles II as a result of having sheltered two of the judges who had condemned his father, Charles I, to death. In 1662, to the acute distress of the New Haven trees, the Crown granted a charter to Connecticut that merged New Haven with the more democratic settlements in the Connecticut Valley. Alright, this next page here is called Makers of America, and seems to have a different color of page than the other pages up until this point, but I'm going to read it anyway, because I'm assuming it's also important. So I'll read this to you too. The English is the name of this next mini-section here. During the late Middle Ages, the Black Death and other epidemics had ravaged England kept the English population in check, but by 1500, increased resistance to such diseases allowed the population to soar, and a century later, the island nation was bustling at the seams. This population explosion, combined with economic depression and religious repression, sparked the first major European migration to England's New World colonies. Some of those who voyaged to Virginia and Maryland in the 17th century were independent artisans or younger members of English gentry families. But roughly 3/4 of the English migrants to the Chesapeake during this period came as servants, assigned to indentures, ranging from 4 to 7 years. One English observer described such indentured service as idle, lazy, simple people, and another complained that many of those taking ship to the colonies have been pursued by hue and cry for robberies, burglaries, or breaking prison. In fact, most indentured service were young men drawn from England's middling classes. Some fled the disastrous slump in the cloth trade in the early 17th century. Many others had been forced off the land as the dawning national economy prompted landowners in southwestern England to convert from crop fields to pasture and to enclose the land for sheep grazing. Made their way from town to town in search of work, they eventually drifted into port cities such as Bristol and London. There they boarded ship for America, where they provided the labor necessary to cultivate the Chesapeake staple crop, tobacco. Some 40% of these immigrants of the mid-17th century died before they had finished their terms of indenture. Because of the high death rate and the shortage of women, Chesapeake society was unable to reproduce itself naturally until the last quarter of the 17th century. The survivors entered Chesapeake society with only their freedom dues, usually clothing, an axe and a hoe, and a few barrels of corn. Nevertheless, many of those who arrived early in the century eventually acquired land and moved into the mainstream Chesapeake society. After 1660, however, opportunities for the freemen declined. In England, the population spurt ended, and the Great London Fire of 1666 sparked a building boom that soaked up job seekers. As the supply of English indentured service dried up in the late 17th century, southern planters looking for laborers turned increasingly to black slaves. Whereas English immigration to the Chesapeake was spread over nearly a century, most English voyagers to New England arrived within a single decade. In the 12 years between 1629 and 1642, some 20,000 Puritans swarmed to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Fleeing a sustained economic depression and the cruel religious repression of Charles I, the Puritans came to plant a godly commonwealth in New England's rocky soil. In contrast to the single indentured servants of the Chesapeake, the New England Puritans migrated in family groups, and in many cases, whole communities were transplanted from England to America. Although they remained united by the common language and common Puritan faith they carried to New England, their English baggage was by no means uniform. As in England, most New England settlements were farming communities, but some New England towns recreated the specialized economies of particular localities in England. Marblehead, Massachusetts, for example, became a fishing village because most of the settlers had been fishermen in Old England. The townsfolk of Raleigh, Massachusetts, brought from Yorkshire and northern England not only their town name, but also their distinctive way of life, revolving around textile manufacturing. Political practices, too, reflected the town's variegated English roots. In Ipswich, Massachusetts, settled by East Anglican Puritans, the ruling select men served long terms and ruled with an iron hand. By contrast, local politics in the town of Newbury were bitter and contentious, and the office holders were hard-pressed to win re-election. The town's founders came from Western England, a religion with little tradition of local government. Although the Puritans' imperial masters in London eventually circumscribed such precious local autonomy, this diverse heritage of fiercely independent New England towns endured, reasserting itself during the American Revolution. Far to the north, enterprising fishermen and fur traders had been active on the coast of Maine for a dozen or so years before the founding of Plymouth. After disheartening attempts at colonization in 1623 by Sir Ferdinando Gorges, this land of lakes and forests was absorbed by Massachusetts Bay after a formal purchase in 1677 from the Gorges heirs. It remained a part of Massachusetts for nearly a century and a half before becoming a separate state. Granite Rib, New Hampshire also sprang from the fishing and trading activities along its narrow coast. It was absorbed in 1641 by the grasping Bay Colony under a strained interpretation of the Massachusetts Charter. The king, annoyed by this display of greed, arbitrarily separated New Hampshire from Massachusetts in 1679 and made it a royal colony. Alright, so this new section is called Puritans versus Indians. It's another little subsection here. The spread of English settlements inevitably led to clashes with the Indians, who were particularly weak in New England. Shortly before the Pilgrims had arrived at Plymouth in 1620, an epidemic, probably triggered by contact with English fishermen, had swept through the coastal tribes and killed more than 3/4 of the native people. Deserted Indian fields, ready for tillage, greeted the Plymouth settlers, and scattered skulls and bones provided grim evidence of the impact of the disease. In no position to resist the English incursion, the local Wampanoag, I'm sorry for butchering that name, Wampanoag Indians at first befriended the settlers. Cultural accommodation was facilitated by Squanto, a Wampanoag who had learned English from a ship's captain who had kidnapped him some years earlier. The Wampanoag chieftain Massasoit signed a treaty with the Plymouth Pilgrims in 1621 and helped them celebrate the first Thanksgiving after the autumn harvest that same year. As more English settlers arrived and pushed inland into the Connecticut River Valley, confrontations between Indians and whites ruptured these peaceful relations. Hostilities exploded in 1637 between the English settlers and the powerful Pequot tribe. Besieging a Pequot village on Connecticut's Mystic River, English militiamen and their Narragansett Indian allies set fire to the Indian wigwams and shot the fleeing survivors. The slaughter wrote a brutal finish to the Pequot War, virtually annihilated the Pequot tribe, and inaugurated 4 decades of uneasy peace between Puritans and Indians. Lashed by critics in England, the Puritans made some feeble efforts at converting the remaining Indians to Christianity, although Puritan missionary zeal never equaled that of the Catholic Spanish and French. A mere handful of Indians were gathered into Puritan praying towns to make the acquaintance of the English God and to learn the ways of English culture. The Indians' only hope for resisting English encroachment lay in interminable unity, a pan-Indian alliance against the swiftly spreading English settlements. In 1675, Massasoit's son, Metacom, called King Philip by the English, forged such an alliance and mounted a series of coordinated assaults on English villages throughout New England. Frontier settlements were especially hard hit, and refugees fell back toward the relative safety of Boston. When the war ended in 1676, 52 Puritan towns had been attacked, and 12 destroyed entirely. Hundreds of colonists had many more Indians lie dead. I'm sorry for that sound. That was an alarm that I set. I don't know if you heard that or if that came up, but if it did, I apologize. Hopefully I'll have cut that out. As a matter of fact, I'm gonna leave a silent spot here just so I can make sure I get rid of that. Okay, there we go. This is a marker for myself, because there's gonna be a lot to edit here. Alright. In 1675, Massasoit's son, Metacom, called King Philip by the English, forged such an alliance and mounted a series of coordinated assaults on English villages throughout New England. Frontier settlements were especially hard hit, and refugees fell back toward the relative safety of Boston. When the war ended in 1676, 52 Puritan towns had been attacked, and 12 destroyed entirely. Hundreds of colonists and many more Indians lay dead. Metacom's wife and son were sold into slavery. He himself was captured, beheaded, and drawn and quartered. His head was carried on a pike back to Plymouth, where it was mounted on grisly display for years. King Philip's wars slowed the westward march of English settlement in New England for several decades. But the war inflicted a lasting defeat on New England's Indians. Drastically reduced in numbers, dispirited, and disbanded, they thereafter posed only sporadic threats to the New England colonists. Alright, so this next subsection is called Seeds of Colonial Unity and Independence. A path-breaking experiment in union was launched in 1643 when 4 colonies banded together to form the New England's Confederation. Old England was deeply involved in civil wars, and hence the colonists were thrown upon their own resources. The primary purpose of the Confederation was defense against foes or potential foes, notably the Indians, the French, and the Dutch. Purely intercolonial problems, such as runaway servants and criminals who had fled from one colony to another, also came within the jurisdiction of the Confederation. Each member colony, regardless of size, wielded 2 votes, an arrangement highly displeasing to the most populous colony, Massachusetts Bay. The Confederation was essentially an exclusive Puritan club. It consisted of the 2 Massachusetts colonies, the Bay Colony and the Bentham-sized Plymouth, and the 2 Connecticut colonies, New Haven and the Scadron Valley settlements. The Puritan leaders blackballed Rhode Island as well as the Maine outposts. It's a weird word, blackballed. These places, it was charged, harbored too many heretical or otherwise undesirable characters. Shockingly, one of the Maine towns had made a tailor its mayor and even sheltered an excommunicated minister of the gospel. Weak though it was, the Confederation was the first noble milestone on the long and rocky road toward colonial unity. The delegates took tottering but long overdue steps toward acting together on matters of intercolonial importance. Rank-and-file colonists, for their part, received valuable experience in delegating their votes to properly chosen representatives. Back in England, the king had paid little attention to the American colonists during the early years of their planting. They were allowed, in effect, to become semi-autonomous commonwealths. This era of benign neglect was prolonged when the crown, struggling to retain its power, became enmeshed during the 1640s in civil wars with the parliamentarians. But when Charles II was restored to the English throne in 1660, the Royalists and their Church of England allies were once more firmly in the saddle. Puritan hopes of eventually purifying the old colonial defense in the event of war with the Indians, and hence, from the imperial viewpoint of Parliament, was a statesmanlike move. More importantly, the Dominion of New England was designed to promote urgently needed efficiency in the administration of the English navigation laws. Those laws reflected the intensifying colonial rivalries of the 17th century. They sought to stitch England's overseas possessions more tightly to the motherland by throttling American trade with countries not ruled by the English crown. Like colonial peoples everywhere, the Americans chafed at such confinements, and smuggling became an increasingly common and honorable occupation. At the head of the new domination stood autocratic Sir Edmund Andros, an able English military man, conscientious but tactless. Establishing headquarters in puritanical Boston, he generated much hostility by his open affiliation with the despised Church of England. The colonists were also outraged by his noisy and Sabbath-profaning soldiers, who were accused of teaching the people to drink, blaspheme, curse, and damn. Andros was prompt to use the mailed fist. He ruthlessly curbed the cherished town meetings, laid heavy restrictions on the courts, the press, and the schools, and revoked all land titles. Dispensing with the popular assemblies, he taxed the people without the consent of their duty-elected representatives. He also strove to enforce the unpopular navigation laws and suppress smuggling. Liberty-loving colonists, accustomed to unusual privileges during long decades of neglect, were goaded to the verge of revolt. The people of Old England, likewise resisting oppression, stole a march on the people of New England. In 1688 through 1689, they engineered the memorable Glorious or Bloodless Revolution. Dethroning the despotic and unpopular Catholic James II, they dethroned the Protestant rulers of the Netherlands and Dutch-born William III and his English wife, Mary, daughter of James II. When the news of the Glorious Revolution reached America, the ramshackle dominion of New England collapsed, like a house of cards. The Boston mob, catching the fever, rose against the existing regime. Sir Edmund Andros attempted to flee in woman's clothing, but was betrayed by boots protruding beneath his dress. He was hastily shipped off to England. Massachusetts, though rid of the despotic Andros, did not gain as much from the upheaval as it had hoped. In 1691, it was arbitrarily made a royal colony, with a new charter and a new royal governor. The permanent loss of the ancient charter was a staggering blow to the proud Puritans, who never fully recovered. Worst of all, the privilege of voting, once the monopoly of church members, was now to be enjoyed by all qualified male property holders. England's glorious revolution reverberated throughout the colonies from New England to the Chesapeake. Inspired by the challenge to the crown in Old England, many colonists used the occasion to strike against royal authority in America. Unrest rocked both New York and Maryland from 1689 to 1691, until newly appointed royal governors restored a semblance of order. Most importantly, the new monarchs relaxed the royal grip on colonial trade, inaugurating a period of salutary neglect, when the much resented navigation laws were only weakly enforced. Yet residues remained of Charles II's effort to assert tighter administrative control over his empire. More English officers, judges, clerks, customs officials, now staffed the courts and strolled the wards of English America. Many were incompetent, corrupt hacks who knew little and cared less about American affairs. Appointed by influential patrons in far-off England, by their very presence they blocked the rise of local leaders to positions of political power. Aggrieved Americans viewed them with mounting contempt and resentment as the 18th century wore on. I have to move my phone here. Alright. Old Netherlanders at New Netherland is the name of this next section. In the late in the 16th century, the opposed people of the Netherlands unfurled the standard of rebellion against Catholic Spain. After bloody and protracted fighting, they finally succeeded, with the aid of Protestant England, in winning their independence. The 17th century, the era of Rembrandt and other famous artists, was a golden age in Dutch history. This vigorous little lowland nation finally emerged as a major commercial and naval power, and then it ungratefully challenged the supremacy of its former benefactor, England. 3 great Anglo-Dutch naval wars were fought in the 17th century, with as many as 100 ships on each side. The sturdy Dutch dealt blows about as heavy as they received. The Dutch Republic also became a leading colonial power, with, by far, its greatest activity in the East Indies. There it maintained an enormous and profitable empire for over 300 years. The Dutch East India Company was virtually a state within the state, and at one time, supported an army of 10,000 men and a fleet of 190 ships, 40 of them men of war. Seeking greater riches, this enterprising company employed an English explorer, Henry Hudson. Disregarding orders to sail northeast, he ventured into Delaware Bay and New York Bay in 1609, and then ascended the Hudson River, hoping that at last he had chanced upon the coveted shortcut through the continent. But, as the event proved, he merely filed a Dutch claim to a magnificently wooded and watered area. Much less powerful than the mighty Dutch East India Company was the Dutch West India Company, which maintained profitable enterprises in the Caribbean. At times, it was less interested in trading than in raiding, and at one fell swoop in 1628 captured a fleet of Spanish treasure ships laden with loot worth 15 million. The company also established outposts in Africa and a thriving sugar industry in Brazil, which for several decades was its principal center of activity in the New World. New Netherland in the beautiful Hudson River area was planted in 1623 to 1624 on a permanent basis. Established by the Dutch West India Company for its quick profit fur trade, it was never more than the secondary interest of the founders. The company's most brilliant stroke was to buy Manhattan Island from the Indians, who did not actually own it, for virtually worthless trinkets. 22,000 acres of what is now perhaps the most valuable real estate in the world for pennies per acre. New Amsterdam, later New York City, was a company town. It was run by and for the Dutch company, in the interest of the stockholders. The investors had no enthusiasm for religious toleration, free speech, or democratic practices, and the governors appointed by the company as directors general were usually harsh and despotic. Religious dissenters who opposed the official Dutch Reformed Church were regarded with suspicion, and for a while Quakers were savagely abused. In response to repeated protests by aggravated colonists, a local body with limited lawmaking power was finally established. This picturesque Dutch colony took on a strongly aristocratic tinge and retained it for generations. Vast feudal estates fronting the Hudson River, known as patroonships, were granted to promoters who agreed to settle 50 people on them. One patroonship in the Albany area was slightly larger than the later state of Rhode Island. Colorful little New Amsterdam attracted a cosmopolitan population, as is common in seaport towns. A French Jesuit missionary visiting in the 1640s noted that the 18 different languages were being spoken in the streets. New York's later babble of immigrant tongues were thus foreshadowed. Alright, this next sub-area is called Friction with English and Swedish Neighbors. Vexations beset the Dutch company colony from the beginning. The directors general were largely incompetent. Company shareholders demanded their dividends, even at the expense of the colony's welfare. The Indians, infuriated by Dutch cruelties, was the golden age of... I just went to the wrong part of the page. I'm terribly sorry. The Indians, infuriated by Dutch cruelties, retaliated with horrible massacres. As a defense measure, the hard-pressed settlers on Manhattan Island erected a stout wall, from which Wall Street derives its name. New England was hostile to the growth of its Dutch neighbor, and the people of Connecticut finally ejected intruding Hollanders from the verdant valley. 3 of the 4-member colonies of the New England Confederation were eager to wipe out New Netherland with military force. But Massachusetts, which would have had to provide most of the troops, vetoed the proposed foray. The Swedes in turn trespassed on Dutch preserves from 1638 to 1655 by planting the anemic colony of New Sweden on the Delaware River. This was the golden age of Sweden during and following the 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648, in which its brilliant King Gustavus Adolphus had carried the torch of Protestantism. This outburst of energy in Sweden caused it to enter the costly colonial game in America, though on something of a shoestring. Resenting the Swedish intrusion on the Delaware, the Dutch dispatched a small military expedition in 1655. It was led by the ablest of the directors general, Peter Stuyvesant, who had lost a leg while soldiering in the West Indies and was dubbed Father Wooden Leg by the Indians. The main fort the main fort fell after a bloodless siege, whereupon Swedish rule came to an abrupt end. The colonists were absorbed by New Netherland. New Sweden, never important, soon faded away, leaving behind in later Delaware a sprinkling of Swedish place names and Swedish log cabins, the first in America, as well as an admixture of Swedish blood. Alright, this next area is called Dutch Residues in New York. Lacking vitality and representing only a secondary commercial interest of the Dutch, New Netherland lay under the menacing shadow of the vigorous English colonies to the north. In addition, it was honeycombed with New England immigrants. Numbering about one half of New Netherland's 10,000 souls in 1664, they might in time have seized control from within. The days of the Dutch on the Hudson were numbered, and the English regarded them as intruders. In 1664, after the imperially ambitious Charles II had granted the area to his brother, the Duke of York, a strong English squadron appeared off the decrepit defenses of New Amsterdam. A fuming Peter Stuyvesant, short of all munitions except courage, was forced to surrender without firing a shot. New Amsterdam was thereupon renamed New York, in honor of the Duke of York. England won a splendid harbor, strategically located in the middle of the mainland colonies, and the stately Hudson River penetrating the interior. With the removal of this foreign wedge, the English banner now waved triumphantly over a solid stretch of territory from Maine to the Carolinas. The conquered Dutch province tenaciously retained many of the illiberal features of earlier days. An autocratic spirit survived, and the aristocratic element gained strength when certain corrupt English governors granted immense acreage to their favorites. Influential landowning families, such as the Livingstons and the De Lanceys, wielded disproportionate power in the affairs of colonial New York. These monopolistic land policies, combined with the lordly atmosphere, discouraged many European immigrants from coming. The physical growth of New York was correspondingly retarded. The Dutch peppered place names over the land, including Harlem, named for Haarlem with two A's, Brooklyn, named for Brooklyn, and Hellgate, named for Hellegat. They likewise left their imprint on the gambrel roof architecture. As for social customs and folkways, no other foreign group of comparable size had made so colorful a contribution. Noteworthy were Easter eggs, Santa Claus, waffles, sauerkraut, bowling, sleighing, skating, and golf, also known as golf. A dangerous game played with heavy clubs and forbidden in settled areas. So golf was forbidden in some places. Wow, imagine that. Alright, so this next little mini area is called Penn's Holy Experiment in Pennsylvania. A remarkable group of dissenters, commonly known as Quakers, arose in England during the mid-1600s. Their name derived from the report that they quaked when under deep religious emotion. Officially, they were known as the Religious Society of Friends. Well, that sounds lovely. Quakers were especially offensive to the authorities, both religious and civil. They refused to support the established Church of England with taxes. They built simple meeting houses, congregated without a paid clergy, and spoke up themselves in meetings when moved. Believing that they were all children in the sight of God, they kept their broad-brimmed hats on in the presence of their betters, and addressed others with simple these and thous, rather than with conventional titles. They would take no oaths because Jesus had commanded, "Swear not at all." This peculiarity often embroiled them with government officials, for test oaths were still required to establish the fact that a person was not a Roman Catholic. The Quakers, beyond a doubt, were a people of deep conviction. They abhorred strife and warfare and refused military service. As advocates of passive resistance, they would turn the other cheek and rebuild their meeting house on the site where their enemies had torn it down. Their courage and devotion to principle finally triumphed. Although at times they seemed stubborn and unreasonable, they were a simple, devoted, democratic people, contending in their own high-minded way for religious and civic freedom. William Penn, a well-born and athletic young Englishman, was attracted to the Quaker faith in 1660, when only 16 years old. His father, disapproving, administered a sound flogging. After various adventures in the army, the best portrait of the peaceful Quaker has him in armor, the youth firmly embraced the despised faith and suffered much persecution. The court branded him a saucy and impertinent fellow. Several hundred of his less fortunate fellow Quakers died of cruel treatment, and thousands more were fined. Several hundred of his less fortunate fellow Quakers died of cruel treatment, and thousands more were flogged, fined, or cast into dark, dank prisons. Penn's thoughts naturally turned to the New World, where a sprinkling of Quakers had already fled, notably to Rhode Island, North Carolina, and New Jersey. Eager to establish an asylum for his people, he had also hoped to experiment with liberal ideas in government and at the same time make a profit. Finally, in 1681, he managed to secure from the king an immense grant of fertile land in consideration of a monetary debt owed to his deceased father by the crown. The king called the area Pennsylvania, or Penn's Woodland, in honor of the sire. The modest son, fearing that critics would accuse him of naming it after himself, sought unsuccessfully to change his name. Pennsylvania was by far the best advertised of all the colonies. Its founder, the first American advertising man, sent out paid agents and distributed countless pamphlets printed in English, Dutch, French, and German. Unlike the lures of many other American real estate promoters, then and later, Penn's inducements were generally truthful. He especially welcomed forward-looking spirits and substantial citizens, including industrious carpenters, masons, shoemakers, and other manual workers. His liberal land policy, which encouraged substantial holdings, was instrumental in attracting a heavy inflow of immigrants. Penn formally launched his colony in 1681. This next area is called Quaker, Pennsylvania, and its neighbors. Penn formally launched his colony in 1681. His task was simplified by the presence of several thousand squatters, Dutch, Swedish, English, Welsh, who were already scattered along the banks of the Delaware River. The Delaware River. Philadelphia, meaning brotherly love in Greek, was more carefully planned than most colonial cities and consequently enjoyed wide and attractive streets. Penn farsightedly bought land from the Indians, including Chief Tammany, later patron saint of New York's political Tammany Hall. His treatment of the native peoples was so fair that the Quaker, broad-brimmed, went among them unharmed and even employed them as babysitters. For a brief period, Pennsylvania seemed the promised land of amicable Indian-white relations. Some southern tribes even migrated to Pennsylvania, seeking the Quaker haven, but ironically, Quaker tolerance proved the undoing of Quaker Indian policy. As non-Quaker European immigrants flooded into the province, they undermined the Quakers' own benevolent policy toward the Indians. The feisty Scots-Irish were particularly unpersuaded by Quaker idealism. Penn's new proprietary regime was unusually liberal and included a representative assembly elected by the landowners. No tax-supported state church drained coffers or demanded allegiance. There's a little section down here which I'll read for you. It says, in a Boston lecture in 1869, Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882, declared, "The sect of the Quakers and their best representatives appeared to me to have come nearer to the sublime history and genius of Christ than any of the other sects." Freedom of worship was guaranteed to all residents, although Penn, under pressure from London, was forced to deny Catholics and Jews the privilege of voting or holding office. The death penalty was imposed only for treason and murder, as compared with 200 capital crimes in England. Among other noteworthy features, no provision was made by the peace-loving Quakers of Pennsylvania for a military defense. No restrictions were placed on immigration, and naturalization was made easy. The humane Quakers early developed a strong dislike of black slavery, and in the genial glow of Pennsylvania some progress was made towards social reform. With its many liberal features, Pennsylvania attracted a rich mix of ethnic groups. They include numerous religious misfits who were repelled by the harsh practices of neighboring colonies. This Quaker refuge boasted a surprisingly modern atmosphere in an unmodern age and to an unusual degree afforded economic opportunity, civil liberty, and religious freedom. Even so, blue laws prohibited ungodly revelers, stage plays, playing cards, dice, games, and excessive hilarity. Under such generally happy auspices, Penn's brainchild grew lustily. The Quakers were shrewd business people, and in a short time the settlers were exporting grain and other foodstuffs. Within 2 years, Philadelphia claimed 300 houses and 3,500 people. Within 19 years, by 1700, the colony was surpassed in population and wealth only by long-established Virginia and Massachusetts. William Penn, who altogether spent about 4 years in Pennsylvania, was never fully appreciated by his colonists. His governors, some of them incompetent and tactless, quarreled bitterly with political control. Penn himself became too friendly with James II, the disposed Catholic king. Thrice arrested for treason, thrust for a time into a debtor's prison, and afflicted by a paralytic stroke, he died full of sorrows. His enduring monument was not only a notable experiment in government, but also a new commonwealth. Based on civil and religious liberty, and dedicated to freedom of conscience and worship, it held aloft a hopeful torch in a world of semi-darkness. Small Quaker settlements flourished next door to Pennsylvania. New Jersey was started in 1664, when two noble proprietors received the area from the Duke of York. A substantial number of New Englanders, including many whose weary soil had petered out, flocked to the new colony. One of the proprietors sold West New Jersey in 1674 to a group of Quakers, who here set up a sanctuary even before Pennsylvania was launched. East New Jersey was also acquired in later years by the Quakers, whom wings were clipped in 1702 when the Crown combined the two Jerseys in a royal colony. Swedish-tinged Delaware consisted of only three countries, two at high tide, the witticism of goes, and was named after Lord de la Warr, the harsh military governor who had arrived in Virginia in 1610. Harboring some Quakers and closely associated with Penn's prosperous colony, Delaware was granted its own assembly in 1703. But until the American Revolution, it remained under the governor of Pennsylvania. Alright, this next section is called The Middle Way in the Middle Colonies. The Middle Colonies, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, enjoyed certain features in common. In general, the soil was fertile and the expanse of land was broad, unlike rock bestrewn New England. Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey came to be known as the bread colonies by virtue of their heavy exports of grain. Rivers also played a vital role. Broad, languid streams, notably the Susquehanna, the Delaware, and the Hudson, tapped the fur trade of the interior and beckoned adventuresome spirits into the back country. I was tripping up on one of those dashes that end on one line and then the next part of it begins on the next line. I always hated those. Interior and beckoned adventuresome spirits into the back country. The rivers had few cascading waterfalls, unlike New England's, and hence presented little inducement to milling or manufacturing with water wheel power. A surprising amount of industry, nonetheless, hummed in the mill colonies. Virginial forests abounded for lumbering and shipbuilding. The presence of deep river ossuaries and landlocked harbors stimulated both commerce, and the growth of seaports, such as New York and Philadelphia. Even Albany, more than 100 miles up the Hudson, was a port of some consequence in colonial days. The mill colonies were in many respects midway between New England and the southern plantation group. Except in aristocratic New York, the landholdings were generally intermediate in size, smaller than in the big acreage South, but larger in small farm New England. Local government lay somewhere between the personalized town meeting of New England and the diffuse country government of the South. There were fewer industries in the mill colonies than in New England, more than in the South. Yet the middle colonies, which in some ways were the most American part of America, could claim certain distinctions in their own right. Generally speaking, the population was more ethnically mixed than that of our settlements. The people were blessed with an unusual degree of religious toleration and democratic control. Earnest and devout Quakers, in particular, made a compassionate contribution to human freedom out of all proportion of their numbers. Desirable land was more easily acquired in the middle colonies than in New England or in the Tidewater South. One result was that a considerable amount of economic and social de- democracy prevailed, though less so in aristocratic New York. Modern-minded Benjamin Franklin, often regarded as the most representative American personality of his era, was a child of the middle colonies, though it is true that Franklin was born to a Yankee in puritanical Boston. He entered Philadelphia as a 17-year-old in 1720 with a loaf of bread under each arm and immediately found a congenial home in the urbane, open atmosphere of what was then North America's biggest city. One Pennsylvania laird boasted that Franklin came to life at 17 in Philadelphia. By the time Franklin arrived in the city of brotherly love, the American colonies were themselves coming to life. Population was growing robustly. Transportation and communication were gradually improving. The British, for the most part, continued their hands-off policies, leaving the colonists to fashion their own local governments, run their own churches, and develop networks of intercolonial trade. As people and products crisscrossed the colonies with increasing frequency and increasing volume, Americans began to realize that, far removed from Mother England, they were not merely surviving, but truly thriving. Alright, so this seems to be the last section. Alright, this is called Europeanizing America or Americanizing Europe. And this is called Varying Viewpoints, I guess. In some way, I guess we're gonna find out. Last section, here we go. The history of discovery and colonization raises perhaps the most fundamental question about all American history. Should it be understood as the extension of European civilization into the New World, or as a gradual development of a uniquely American culture? An older school of thought tended to emphasize the Europeanization of America. Historians of that persuasion paid close attention to the situation in Europe, particularly England and Spain, in the 15th and 16th centuries. They also focused on the exportation of the values and institutions of the mother countries to the new lands in the Western Sea. Although some historians also examined the transforming effect of America on Europe, this approach, too, remained essentially Eurocentric. More recently, historians have concentrated on the distinctiveness of America. The concern with European origins has evolved into a comparative treatment of European settlements in the New World. England, Spain, Holland, and France now attract more attention for the divergent kinds of societies they fostered in America than for the way they commonly pursued Old World ambitions in the New. The newest trend to emerge in a transatlantic history that views European empires and their American colonies as part of a process of cultural cross-fertilization affecting not only the colonies but Europe and Africa as well. This less Eurocentric approach has also changed the way historians explain the colonial development of America. Rather than telling the story of colonization as the imposition of European ways of thought through discovery and conquest, historians increasingly view the colonial period as one of the contact and adaptation between European, African, and Native American ways of life. Scholars including Richard White, Alfred Crosby, William Cronon, Karen Kupperman, and Timothy Silver have enhanced understanding of the cultural as well as the physical transformations that resulted from contact. An environment of forests and meadows, for example, gave way to a landscape of fields and fences as Europeans sought to replicate the agricultural villages they had known in Europe. Aggressive deforestation even produced climatic changes, as treeless tracts made for colder winters, hotter summers, and earth-gouging floods. Oh, and earth-gouging floods. I thought that was going somewhere else. Raymond Gertrude's When Jesus Came, the Corn Mothers Went Away, from 1991, has expanded the colonial stage to include interactions between Spanish settlers and Native Americans in the Southwest. The variety of American societies that emerged out of the interaction of Europeans and Native Americans has also become better appreciated. Early histories by esteemed historians like Perry Miller exaggerated the extent to which the New England Puritan experience defined the essence of America. Not only did these historians overlook non-English experiences, they failed to recognize the diversity of motives, methods, and consequences that existed even within English colonization. The numbers alone tell an interesting story. By 1700, about 22,000 English colonists had immigrated to the Caribbean. About 1,200,000, I think that's what that says. 120,000. I think that's what this says. I'm just gonna say 120,000 to the southern mainland colonies, and only about 40,000 to the mid-Atlantic and New England colonies. Although by the 18th century, those headed for the latter destination would account for more than half the total. Studies such as Richard S. Dunn's Sugar and Slaves from 1972 emphasize the importance of the Caribbean and early English colonization efforts and made clear that the desire for economic gain, more than the quest for religious freedom, fueled the migration to the Caribbean islands. Similarly, Edmund S. Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom from 1975 stresses the role of economic ambition in explaining the English peopling of the Chesapeake and the eventual importance of African slaves to that region. Studies by Bernard Bailyn and David Hackett Fisher demonstrate that there was a scarcely typical English migrant to the New World. English colonists migrated both singly and in families, and for economic, social, political, and religious reasons. Recent studies have also paid more attention to the conflicts that emerged out of this diversity in settler populations and colonial societies. This perspective emphasizes the contest for economic and political supremacy within the colonies, such as the efforts of the Massachusetts Bay elite to ward off the challenges of religious heretics, and the pressures that an increasingly restless lower class put on wealthy merchants and large landowners. Nowhere was internal conflict so prevalent as in the ethnically diverse middle colonies, where factional antagonisms became the defining feature of public life. The picture of colonial America that is emerging from all this new scholarship is of a society unique and diverse from inception. No longer simply Europe transplanted, American colonial society by 1700 is now viewed as an outgrowth of many intertwining roots, of different European and African heritages, of varied encounters with native peoples and a wilderness environment, and of complicated mixtures of settler populations, each with its own distinctive set of ambitions. And that is the entirety of Chapter 3 in the American Pageant book. How many pages was that? That was a lot of pages. That was like 30 pages worth of knowledge. I don't know how much I'm going to remember this. I hope someone gets some help out of this. I don't know how helpful this would be to some people, but hey, maybe some people can understand history better when they listen to a big old dork like me read it out. So that was Chapter 3 of the American Pageant book, Settling the Northern Colonies. I hope you enjoyed listening, and maybe I'll do another reading like this again some other time. Anyways, that's it. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye!